our 7.12 release, we add the ability not only to capture the quotes for the carrier moving the load, but also vendor quotes for third parties that also offer services on a load like warehousing, lumper services, etc. Let me show you. To begin, I'll show you that in the FQA on our load detail page, we've added a tab to house vendor quotes. Now I mentioned these quotes represent charges that are inherent on a load but do not relate to the transportation of that freight from point A to point B. So this is not the carrier moving the load. This is a warehouse, a lumper, some of the additional charges that can be incurred but that you want to store and get to use in your margin calculations without affecting the carrier quote on the load. To show you how it works, you can see I have a vendor quote pulled up here. I've just opened my FQA. I've done nothing but search for the vendor service in my system that will allow me to store those charges on the load. Now, to back up a second here, the vendor service that you're seeing works just like the carrier services we have today. I've built a carrier service in my system with a service type of vendor instead of carrier. And this allows it to show up in the search back on the FQA in that load. Now, to show you, I'll click New here. In my vendor service, I'll type in lumper, and I'll find Liam's Lumpers. Now the quote contact we use to deliver vendor rate confirmations, which is just a simple document just saying those charges we discussed, they've been accepted, and here's confirmation of those charges. The contact comes from the transportation profile for Liam's Lumpers and is simply used on this quote. I'll then jump in and decide which charge this applies to. We'll just use blind shipments here as an example. I'll add my charge and I will hit accept. And now this quote is stored on the load, again separate from the carrier quote and the carrier I've booked on this load, but can be used in margin calculations if you're calculating commissions or if you want to look at the margin you're making on a given load. Now, our margin is visualized today in the financial summary, and a couple of things have changed to house these vendor quotes for this feature. Most notably, there's a pick list at the top of the financial summary now, which allows you to toggle back and forth between carrier only, or just the carrier moving the load, and all quotes, which includes the carrier moving the load and any vendor invoices, vendor quotes, or payments, depending on the row you're looking at. In addition, we also added a vendor quotes relationship to the carrier removal process. To show you how that works, I'll jump to this other load here, open up the FQA, and you can see here I've got stored rate carrier 1 booked here. They are assigned, this quote's accepted, but I want to remove them from this load and book somebody else, and I may or may not owe them a TONU or a removal charge. So I'll click the X here to remove this carrier. Don't worry about the removal reason here, but I am worried about the removal charge. When I toggle this to yes, you'll notice that the accessorial lookup, which has always been there, is populated with vehicle ordered not used. The charge and the currency, none of that has changed. What has changed is you'll now see a vendor service lookup here. So if I type in the vendor I have booked on this one, again, stored rate, carrier 1, I'm selecting the vendor service that applies to this load. Now also I have the ability to create a brand new vendor service straight from this modal if need be. Super easy to add these to the system and doesn't require a lot of work in the background. I'll also then select my quote contact, my VONU charge, and when I hit remove carrier, not only are we removing this carrier from the load, we're reverting the load statuses, following all the same processes we do today, we're also creating a vendor quote so that we can keep the removal charges separate from the carrier charges if need be. That is, for example, if we're going to end up moving this load with a different carrier and we want to keep those charges separate but on the same load. When I jump back to the Freight Quote Assistant, you'll see here that my stored rate carrier 1 is no longer accepted and has been removed from the quotes list. And in the vendor quotes, I have that vendor quote representing my vehicle ordered not used removal charge included on the load. And as I showed you before, it's now included in the financial summary. When I have all quotes, it's showing me that quoted amount. So as you can see, this new vendor quotes feature gives you the ability to capture more vendors, more service providers on the same load. It's going to improve your margin calculations. It's going to keep all of the charges for a given load in the same place, that freight quote assistant. And it's going to allow you to visualize in the financial summary the margin you're making on the load, not just for the carrier you have to pay to move that freight from point A to point B, but all of the other potential charges that may be incurred along the way. This is going to give you a much more holistic view of the financials for a given load.